The wind was cold over northern France that summer of 1943. The fields below, once golden with wheat, had turned to scarred soil, crisscrossed with trenches, tire tracks, and the remains of fallen machines. On that day, a sound cut through the grey sky, the roar of a thunderous engine, deep and relentless. It was an American P-47 Thunderbolt, one of the heaviest and most powerful fighter aircraft of the war. But this one was losing altitude. Inside the cockpit, smoke filled the pilot's lungs. He had taken flak from an anti-aircraft battery near Rouen. The control stick trembled in his hands, oil pressure dropping fast. He radioed his squadron once, but his words drowned in static. Then, with one final breath, he guided his machine toward an empty field and pulled the lever. The landing gear hit hard, metal screeching over earth. The enormous aircraft skidded, turned sideways, and came to a halt, its wings half buried in mud. The engine sputtered twice, then fell silent. Villagers ran from their homes. But before they could reach the wreck, German soldiers had already surrounded the site. What they found left them speechless. An American aircraft almost intact, enormous, with 8 machine guns mounted on its wings, and an armor so thick that even the crash had barely dented its skin. The swastika-marked trucks arrived soon after. Engineers and officers stepped down, taking photographs, measuring the propeller, whispering to one another. Among them stood Hans-Werner Lerche, a tall, composed man in his early 30s, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced test pilots. His face was calm, almost gentle, but his eyes carried the weight of countless flights and near-death dives. He had tested everything: the agile Messerschmitt Bf 109, the sturdy Focke-Wulf 190, even the first prototypes of Germany's jet projects. Yet as he approached the captured Thunderbolt, something about it stirred his curiosity. The fuselage seemed to defy logic, massive, round, almost clumsy in appearance. "How can this beast even fly?" one mechanic whispered. Lerche ran his gloved hand along the metal surface, feeling its cold, foreign texture. Beneath his fingertips, he could sense the difference. The Americans had built this plane for endurance, not elegance. He turned to his crew and said quietly, "Prepare it for transport. I want it taken to Rechlin." Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's secret testing base, lay hidden deep within Germany's forests. It was a place of silence and precision. Long runways surrounded by lakes and pine trees, where the hum of engines echoed like a strange symphony. Here, captured enemy planes were studied, flown, and compared. Each discovery was a piece of the puzzle that might give Germany an advantage. But by 1943, the war had begun to shift. Allied bombers filled the skies, and German industry was bleeding. The test pilots of Rechlin worked under pressure, aware that every experiment could change the fate of their nation. When the P-47 arrived, covered in dust from its journey, the German engineers could hardly hide their fascination. They had never seen such a large, single-engine fighter. Its motor, a Pratt Whitney R-2800 double wasp, was twice the size of what most German aircraft carried. The wings were wide and thick, designed not for grace, but for brutal strength. One mechanic tapped the armor with a wrench. "It's like a flying tank," he muttered. Lerche watched them work in silence. For him, flying a foreign machine was never just a technical mission, it was psychological. Every aircraft carried the soul of the people who built it. He often said, "When you fly your enemy's plane, you begin to understand how he thinks." And that was what intrigued him about the Thunderbolt. It wasn't just a machine. It was a message from across the ocean, a symbol of a different philosophy: strength over speed, reliability over risk. Days passed as the team repaired minor damage and replaced parts. The American markings were painted over, replaced with the black cross of the Luftwaffe. The cockpit labels, still in English, were translated and re-engraved in German. Every bolt, every cable was inspected. At night, the hangar lights glowed softly through the mist, and the mechanics whispered about what the test might reveal. Some joked nervously that the plane was too heavy to leave the ground again. Others feared it might explode mid-flight. Lerche said nothing. He simply studied the technical manuals, memorizing every figure and diagram. On the morning of the flight, the air was still. The sky, pale and metallic. Lerche climbed into the cockpit, adjusting his oxygen mask and straps. He noticed how spacious it was compared to his own aircraft. Instruments glowed with a faint amber light, neat and simple. The throttle lever felt firm under his hand. He pressed the starter button. A deep growl filled the hangar, then a powerful rumble that shook the ground. The double wasp came alive, spinning its enormous propeller in a blur of silver. Mechanics stepped back, covering their ears. The sound was unlike anything they had ever heard, heavy, confident, alive. Lerche's lips moved in a whisper. "Let's see what you can do." He released the brakes. The aircraft began to roll forward, slowly at first, then faster. Dust rose behind the wheels. At full throttle, the P-47 surged down the runway like a beast unleashed. For a moment, it seemed too heavy to rise, and then, with a sudden grace, it lifted into the air, its wings slicing through the morning haze. From the ground, the men at Rechlin watched in silence as the American fighter, now bearing German crosses, climbed higher and higher into the pale sky. One of them murmured, "He's flying the enemy's thunder." High above the clouds, Lerche felt something shift within him. The control stick was steady, the engine's rhythm perfect. He smiled beneath his mask. It wasn't just another machine. It was a revelation. And in that moment, the narrator would whisper, the German pilot understood that this was no ordinary aircraft. It was something far more dangerous, the future itself. The morning mist hung over Rechlin like a veil, soft and silver. From a distance, the airfield looked peaceful, a serene lake reflecting the first rays of the sun, rows of pine trees whispering in the breeze. But beneath that calm tension lived in every shadow. Soldiers moved silently, engineers whispered to one another, and guards checked their watches with nervous glances. Somewhere behind the tall hangar doors, a secret hummed, the kind of secret that could alter the course of a war. The American plane, the P-47 Thunderbolt, rested in the middle of the hangar, gleaming under artificial light. The once faded olive drab had been repainted in dark grey, with the black cross of the Luftwaffe on its flanks. The mechanics had spent nights repairing its engine, polishing its propeller, and inspecting its enormous fuselage. Now, it looked reborn, as if it had crossed from one world into another. Pilot Hans-Werner Lerche arrived in silence, his boots echoing softly on the concrete floor. He greeted no one at first. He simply stopped in front of the aircraft, hands behind his back, studying every curve. There was something almost human in the way he looked at machines, not as cold metal, but as living beings with temperaments and moods. His mechanics knew this about him. When he flew, he listened to the plane as if it spoke to him. "Ready for flight, Herr Lerche," said Chief Engineer Müller, handing him a clipboard. Lerche nodded, flipping through the checklist. Fuel, pressure, hydraulics, control surfaces. Everything was perfect. But his mind wasn't just on the numbers. It was on the mystery this aircraft represented, the craftsmanship of an enemy so distant yet so advanced. He turned to his co-pilot, who would monitor the instruments from the ground. "If this plane flies as it looks," Lerche said softly, "it will not only fight, it will endure." Outside, the morning was still heavy with fog. The Thunderbolt rolled out of the hangar, its landing gear crunching softly over the gravel. German officers in long leather coats stood at the edge of the runway, their faces half hidden by caps and smoke. To them, this test was more than curiosity. It was espionage through flight. Every second of this mission would be documented, measured, and classified. Lerche climbed into the cockpit, his movements deliberate and calm. He placed his gloves neatly on the dashboard, adjusted his harness, and ran his fingers over the unfamiliar English markings. Flaps, mixture, boost, he murmured, translating instinctively. Behind him, the crew stood waiting, hands raised in anticipation. When he pressed the ignition button, the sound shattered the silence. The Pratt Whitney R-2800 roared awake, its cylinders firing like the heartbeat of a giant. The ground vibrated. Even the German officers stepped back. For a moment, all eyes were on that aircraft, a machine born in America, now carrying German insignia into the sky. The takeoff was smooth. The heavy fighter accelerated with surprising grace, lifting off long before expected. Lerche pulled back on the stick, feeling the solid resistance of the controls. The plane didn't just respond, it obeyed. It felt stable, powerful, unshakable. In his years as a test pilot, he had flown dozens of aircraft, but none had this presence. It climbs like a bear, he thought, smiling behind his mask. Up in the clouds, Rechlin disappeared beneath a blanket of white. Lerche leveled off and began his maneuvers. He pushed the throttle forward, testing the torque. The response was instant. The engine growled, the wings trembled slightly, and the aircraft surged ahead, slicing through the air with the determination of a predator. Down below, the engineers watched through binoculars, their notebooks ready. "Incredible," one muttered. At this speed, the FW-190 would already be shaking apart. But what fascinated Lerche wasn't just the speed, it was the feeling. The Thunderbolt moved as if it carried its own gravity, steady and balanced. Even in dives, the nose held firm. The controls remained smooth, not stiff or twitchy like the German fighters. It was forgiving, almost comforting. This plane protects the man inside, he thought. It doesn't fight him. He pulled into a dive to test the limits. 5,000 meters, 4,000, 3. The air screamed against the fuselage. The altimeter spun faster. In a Messerschmitt, the wings would have started to tremble by now. But the Thunderbolt? It stayed calm. He pushed it further until the speed needle touched the red line, over 800 kilometers per hour. And still the plane held together. The sound around him became a blur, his body pressed against the seat. For a moment, he wondered if he'd survive the pull-up. Then he eased back the stick, and the P-47 rose smoothly again, steady as a train on rails. When he leveled out, his breath came hard, his hands trembling with adrenaline. He looked at the horizon, where the morning sun had broken through the clouds, casting gold over the fields below. In that silence, a realization formed. The Americans had built something no one else could. He spoke into his radio. "To ground control. This aircraft is unlike anything I've flown. Its power is extraordinary. Even at full dive, stability remains. It feels indestructible." On the ground, the engineers exchanged looks. Muller scribbled notes rapidly. "Repeat that," he said. Lerche's voice came again, calm but charged with awe. "If our pilots ever face this machine in the sky, they will be fighting a fortress." As he began his descent, the airfield appeared once more, glimmering in the sunlight. The landing was perfect, smooth, almost theatrical. The wheels touched down gently, the propeller wind fading into silence. When Lerche opened the canopy, a gust of fresh air swept through, carrying the scent of pine and oil. The ground crew erupted in cautious applause. He climbed down, removed his helmet, and smiled faintly. "This," he said, resting his hand on the metal surface, "is not just an airplane. It's a philosophy." They looked at him, puzzled. "A philosophy?" Muller asked. Lerche nodded. "The Americans don't build for speed. They build for endurance. They build so the man can come home." The hangar went quiet. For a long time, no one spoke. Even the officers seemed thoughtful. But what none of them knew, the narrator's voice would say, low and deliberate, was that Lerche's next flight would reveal something even more astonishing, a discovery hidden deep within the heart of the Thunderbolt. The morning after the first test, Rechlin was shrouded in fog. The air smelled faintly of oil and damp grass. Mechanics moved like ghosts among the hangars, their boots echoing softly on the wet concrete. Yet inside the largest hangar, something unusual was happening. The American plane was being polished again, its cowling open, its massive radial engine exposed like the heart of some metal beast. The night crew had worked until dawn under Lerche's supervision. He hadn't gone home. He stood there now, his uniform slightly wrinkled, his eyes red from lack of sleep. Before him, the Thunderbolt rested silently, its propeller blades still, its body shining under the overhead lights. The test from the previous day had changed him. There had been admiration in his voice when he landed, but now there was something deeper, a question. Lerche's hand brushed the cool metal of the fuselage as he whispered to himself, "What are you hiding, my friend?" He called her friend, a habit he had with machines he respected. Most pilots in the Luftwaffe treated their aircraft as tools of war. Lerche treated them as partners. Each had its own temperament, the proud Messerschmitt that demanded precision, the temperamental Focke-Wulf that punished mistakes. But this P-47, it was different. It didn't fight him, it protected him. As engineers removed engine panels, they revealed a maze of pipes, compressors and shining valves. The Pratt Whitney R-2800 double Wasp, the most powerful piston engine in the world, filled the space like a living organism. German eyes widened as they studied its twin superchargers, one mechanical, one driven by exhaust gases, feeding the cylinders with an efficiency they had never seen. "It's over-engineered," muttered one mechanic. "No," Lerche corrected gently. "It's perfectly engineered. Every part here has a purpose." He leaned closer, tracing the network of tubes with his gloved hand. "They didn't just build power," he murmured. "They built endurance." For the next hour, he examined the cockpit again, taking notes. The controls were heavy, yes, but logical. Everything was within reach. Even the seat was wide, cushioned, designed for long hours in the air. There was thoughtfulness here, empathy. Whoever had designed this cockpit had cared about the man who would sit inside it. As the day warmed, Lerche returned to the sky for another flight. This time, he climbed higher, past the clouds, where the sunlight turned the canopy into gold. The horizon stretched endlessly, and the hum of the engine became hypnotic. He tested everything: climbs, dives, turns, gun synchronization, fuel mixture. Every reaction was steady, predictable. At 25,000 feet, he reduced throttle and let the aircraft glide. The silence was profound. From that height, the Earth looked distant and peaceful, almost innocent, a cruel contrast to the war raging below. He thought of the American pilot who had once sat here, the man who had fought bravely until his capture. Did he love this machine the way I do now? Lerche wondered. Did he feel safe in her arms? He felt something stir in his chest. Not guilt, but respect. He began a series of steep dives, pushing the plane to its limits again. The air screamed against the fuselage, and the controls grew heavy. The altimeter spun downward, 7,000 meters, 6,000, 5,000. The pressure built, his vision narrowing to a grey tunnel. Then, with practiced grace, he pulled the stick back, muscles trembling. The aircraft leveled smoothly, wings steady, no shudder, no protest. When he finally exhaled, sweat clung to his forehead beneath the helmet. He let out a laugh, quiet, almost disbelieving. "You magnificent monster," he spoke into his recorder. "Test flight number 2 confirms the Thunderbolt's astonishing durability. Structural integrity remains intact even under extreme aerodynamic stress. No vibration, no stall tendency. This aircraft can dive faster than any German fighter currently in service." Down below, the engineers listened through static-filled radios, recording every word. Müller shook his head. If what he says is true, this thing could survive a vertical dive through hell itself. When Lerche landed, the men surrounded him with questions. He pulled off his helmet, his hair damp, his eyes alive. "Gentlemen," he said, "I've never flown anything so powerful, and yet so gentle." He sat on the wing, looking at the horizon. "In our fighters, the pilot must command every second, every movement, or he dies. In this one, it feels as if the plane itself refuses to let him die." A silence followed. Even the officers nearby seemed affected by his tone. One of the younger mechanics, a boy barely 19, asked shyly, "Do you think we could build something like it, Herr Lerche?" Lerche looked at the boy, then at the aircraft, the emblem of an enemy yet so full of brilliance. "No," he said softly, "not now, not while we are fighting. To build something like this, one must first believe he will live to see peace." The hangar fell quiet. Outside, the engines of other planes roared to life, taking off into the distant hum of war. But here, among steel and shadows, something human flickered, admiration, even tenderness, toward the creation of a rival nation. As dusk fell, Lerche wrote his report by hand. His handwriting was careful, his words precise. He described the Thunderbolt's aerodynamic stability, the supercharger's design, and the self-sealing fuel tanks that could survive multiple bullet hits. But at the bottom, he added a personal note that would never appear in the official archives. "This aircraft carries the soul of its makers, their patience, their faith, their belief in the man who flies it. It is not a weapon of hatred, but of conviction. To defeat an enemy like this, one must first understand his heart." He set down his pen, staring at the words for a long time. Then he closed the notebook and looked once more at the silent, gleaming machine. The light from the hangar doors spilled across its wings, and for a moment the black crosses painted on its sides seemed to fade beneath the original American star hidden under the layers of paint. "Tomorrow," he whispered, "I will look deeper, into the heart of its power." The morning broke with the scent of rain and the soft rumble of thunder somewhere beyond the lake. Inside the Rechlin testing base, the hangar lights flickered awake, illuminating the metallic giant that had kept everyone awake for nights. The captured P-47 Thunderbolt. Its enormous radial engine gleamed like a heart of steel beneath the open cowling, every pipe and cable catching the golden light. The air was thick with the smell of fuel, metal, and tension. Hans-Werner Lerche stood beside the plane, his uniform jacket undone, sleeves rolled to his elbows. His hair was slightly disheveled. He had barely slept. He looked less like a soldier and more like a scientist possessed by wonder. Around him, a dozen engineers gathered with notebooks, magnifying lenses, and nervous anticipation. Today, they would open the secret that had puzzled every German mind since the first test flight. How did the Americans build such unstoppable power? "Begin," Lerche said simply. Two mechanics lifted the engine cover fully, revealing the massive Pratt Whitney R-2800 double Wasp, 18 cylinders arranged in two perfect rows, the craftsmanship as intricate as a Swiss watch. Steam rose from the cooling lines. For a moment there was silence, a kind of reverent awe that made even the soldiers lower their voices. Chief Engineer Müller broke the silence. "Look at this, Herr Lerche, a dual supercharger system. One driven mechanically, the other by exhaust pressure. The airflow management is ingenious." Lerche crouched beside him, tracing a line of polished tubes with a gloved hand. "They feed each other," he murmured. "One breathes for the other." He looked up at the others. "That's why she doesn't choke at altitude. While our BMW and Jumo engines gasp above 6,000 meters, this one still sings. They worked for hours, unscrewing panels, sketching diagrams. Every discovery seemed to contradict German assumptions about how much weight an aircraft could carry, or how much heat a piston could endure. The Americans had defied logic. They had built a monster that shouldn't have flown, yet flew better than anything else in the sky. As the investigation continued, Lerche's fascination deepened. "They don't build engines like we do," he said. "We chase perfection. They chase practicality. Ours are like sculptures. Theirs are like hearts, ugly, strong, impossible to kill." Müller laughed under his breath. "Then perhaps beauty is our weakness." The remark lingered in the air longer than either of them expected. Later that afternoon, Lerche called for a test run. The mechanics fueled the aircraft, and he climbed once more into the cockpit. The seat felt familiar now, comforting, almost protective. He placed his hand on the throttle and whispered, "Show me what you hide inside." When the engine started, the ground shook. The R-2800 came to life with a growl that felt alive, steady, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. The Germans standing nearby were used to the high-pitched whine of their liquid-cooled engines, but this was different. It was earthy, almost human. Lerche pushed the throttle forward. The sound grew deeper, the vibrations stronger. The pressure gauges climbed steadily, never stalling, never faltering. Even at maximum power, the engine didn't waver. It roared with confidence, as if daring the air itself to resist. Inside the cockpit, the pilot's heart raced. He felt connected to the machine in a way that frightened him. "It's like flying an animal," he thought, "a creature that protects me." As he lifted off the runway, the rain began to fall, gentle at first, then heavier. Droplets streaked across the canopy like silver veins. The sky above was grey and endless. Lerche climbed through the storm, testing how the engine performed under pressure. Even drenched in rain and turbulence, the Thunderbolt remained stable, its great radial heart pounding faithfully. At altitude, the clouds opened, revealing the golden light of late afternoon. Lerche looked down at the endless stretch of forest and lakes below, and for a fleeting moment he felt a strange peace. The war, the orders, the fear, all of it seemed distant. There was only him and the hum of the engine. He spoke into his recorder. "The American engine is not just powerful, it is resilient, forgiving. It runs as though built with compassion, not cruelty. It carries its pilot home." Down on the ground, Müller listened to the transmission and frowned. Compassion in a machine. But one of the younger engineers whispered, "He's right. That's what it feels like." When Lerche landed, the rain had stopped. The setting sun reflected off the puddles, bathing the airfield in amber light. He climbed down slowly, touching the cowling of the aircraft as if it were alive. Müller approached him, holding the flight report. "We've compared everything. The airflow system, the oil cooling, the self-sealing fuel tanks. Their designs are decades ahead of ours." Lerche nodded, his expression unreadable. "They build as if they believe their pilots deserve to survive." Müller hesitated. "And we?" Lerche's eyes softened. "We build as if we expect them to die." The hangar fell silent. The words echoed like a confession no one dared to make before. That night, Lerche stayed behind after everyone left. Alone with the Thunderbolt, he sat on the wing under the dim light, listening to the ticking of cooling metal. The plane seemed to breathe. He thought about the American pilot who had once fought in it, the courage it must have taken to face the enemy over foreign soil. And then he thought of all the German pilots who never returned. He removed his gloves and placed a bare hand on the metal. "If machines can carry mercy," he whispered, "then maybe men can too." For the first time in months, he felt something strange. Hope. Not for victory, but for understanding. As the lights dimmed, the Thunderbolt stood in silence, its surface gleaming like wet silver. The sound of distant thunder rolled across the horizon again, echoing the heartbeat of the mighty engine that had just rewritten everything he thought he knew. And the next morning, the narrator's voice would say softly, what Lerche discovered in his final report would shake the confidence of the Luftwaffe itself. The rain had stopped by dawn, leaving behind a world washed clean. The pine trees shimmered with dew, and thin wisps of fog curled along the runway. Inside the Rechlin testing base, a strange stillness lingered, as if the earth itself were holding its breath. The Thunderbolt stood alone on the tarmac, its dark grey paint glistening in the pale light. The black cross of the Luftwaffe still covered its sides, but beneath it, faint and ghost-like, the original white star of the United States Air Force had begun to reappear through the layers of paint. Hans-Werner Lerche watched it from a distance. He had flown dozens of aircraft for the Reich, but none had haunted him like this one. He felt as though the American machine carried a conscience, not of steel, but of spirit. Every time he touched it, he sensed a quiet defiance, as if the plane refused to be part of anyone's war. He entered the hangar where the smell of oil and rain mingled with paper and ink. His final report lay half-written on the table, scattered with photographs, diagrams, and grease-smudged notes. Around him, engineers worked silently, knowing this would be their last day with the Thunderbolt before it was shipped elsewhere for further testing. Lerche sat down, straightened his papers, and began to write. His pen scratched steadily across the page. Evaluation of American P-47 Thunderbolt, serial unknown. Aircraft tested under variable atmospheric conditions at altitudes up to 28,000 feet. Engine, Pratt Whitney R-2800 double wasp. Performance remarkable, unmatched by German equivalents. He paused, tapping the pen against his lips. His handwriting was neat, almost elegant, a contrast to the hard industrial world around him. But what he wrote next was not meant for engineers or generals. It came from somewhere deeper, from the part of him that still believed machines could tell truths that men refused to hear. The Thunderbolt is not designed for beauty. It is designed for survival. Every element of its construction speaks of restraint and purpose. It carries not arrogance, but confidence, not fury, but faith. He lifted his eyes to the aircraft through the hangar window. Sunlight filtered through the clouds, breaking in thin golden rays that fell directly on the plane's wings. The scene was quiet, reverent, like a chapel. Chief Engineer Müller entered quietly, holding a clipboard. "The officers want your report by noon," he said. "They're expecting technical details, not poetry." Lerche smiled faintly. "Sometimes the truth is poetry." Müller sighed but didn't argue. He had seen the change in Lerche, the way his eyes softened when he spoke of the American design, the way his tone had lost the sharpness of military pride. "You respect this plane too much," Müller said softly. "It's still the enemy." Lerche looked at him, his expression calm. "Machines don't have enemies. Only men do." The words hung in the air like a confession. Müller nodded slowly, understanding more than he wished to admit. That afternoon, Lerche conducted his final inspection. He walked around the aircraft one last time, running his hand along the smooth metal skin. He paused beneath the wings, near the 8 machine guns, once symbols of destruction, now silent. He imagined the American pilot who had once trusted this machine with his life, perhaps thinking of home, of someone waiting for him. "Did you survive?" Lerche whispered to the absent man. "Or did this sky take you too?" He climbed into the cockpit one final time. The familiar scent of oil and leather wrapped around him. He traced the dials, the throttle, the oxygen regulator, every part now known by heart. He closed his eyes and listened to the faint ticking of cooling metal. It sounded like a heartbeat fading into memory. Then quietly he spoke to the aircraft. You showed me what they built with hope, and we, what we built with fear." When he descended, the airfield was emptying. Soldiers were loading equipment into trucks, the sky beginning to darken again with the approach of rain. Lerche handed his report to Müller, sealed and signed. "Send it to Berlin," he said. Müller glanced at the envelope and frowned. "You didn't censor anything?" Lerche shook his head. "Let them read it, every word." He turned away before Müller could respond and walked outside. The wind caught his coat as he stepped onto the wet runway. The Thunderbolt stood behind him, silent and proud, its shadow stretching long across the concrete. Somewhere deep inside, Lerche knew he would never fly it again. That night, after everyone had gone, Müller opened the sealed report out of curiosity. Between the official data and performance charts, he found a final handwritten note, a paragraph clearly not meant for military archives. "War teaches us to measure strength in firepower and fear, but true power lies in compassion, in the will to protect rather than to destroy. The P-47 is proof of this. Built not for death but for return, it carries the heart of a nation that believes its sons are worth bringing home." Müller closed the folder slowly. His eyes lingered on the last line, "worth bringing home." For the first time, he felt the war's weight not as duty, but as sorrow. Weeks later, as Allied bombers filled the skies over Germany, the Thunderbolt's data was quietly archived, its lessons ignored by a government blinded by desperation. Yet among the engineers at Rechlin, stories persisted, of a test pilot who called an enemy plane a friend, and of a moment when the enemy's machine taught them humanity. In the end, Hans-Werner Lerche survived the war. He never flew for the Luftwaffe again, but years later he would be invited to England to test Allied aircraft for research. When he saw another Thunderbolt parked on the runway, untouched by time, he removed his hat, smiled faintly, and whispered the same words he had spoken in Rechlin, "You magnificent creature." He climbed into the cockpit once more, older now, gentler, and as the engine roared to life, echoing across the airfield, the sound carried not the fury of war, but the heartbeat of understanding.